Watch the first 10 seconds twice. This Munsters scene isn't right. There's a piece of footage from 1964 that anyone can still find and watch today, and for the first several seconds, everything about it looks exactly right. The house is right. The staircase is right. Herman is standing there, tall and flat-headed, precisely the way generations of viewers remember him. Grandpa is there too, hunched and cranky in his cape. But then something starts to feel off, and most people watching only ever catch one of the two things that are actually wrong with the scene. The woman standing next to Herman is not the woman anyone recognizes as Lily Munster. And once you notice that, there's a second, stranger detail hiding in plain sight that almost nobody clocks the first time through. Stay with this one, because by the end you'll never watch the opening of a rerun the same way again. At first glance, the footage plays like a perfectly normal episode of The Munsters. It has the right sets, the right monster movie energy, even the right actor playing Herman, since that's unmistakably Fred Gwynne under the flathead makeup, with his towering frame filling the doorway the way it always did. Al Lewis is there too, playing Grandpa exactly as fans would come to know him. Even Marilyn, the family's unfortunate niece, is present and accounted for. And yet the whole scene carries a strange undertone almost immediately. The woman beside Herman isn't Yvonne DiCarlo. She has long dark hair, a black dress, and a colder, sharper presence than the warm, doting Lily audiences grew up with. In this version, her name isn't even Lily. She's introduced as Phoebe Munster, and her marriage to Herman plays out with far more tension and edge than the loving partnership fans remember. That's the first problem, and it's the one most casual viewers eventually notice, usually with a slight double take. The second problem takes longer to register, and it's easy to miss entirely if you're not paying attention. The footage is in color. For most people, The Munsters exists entirely in black and white, and that visual style is baked into how the show feels. The shadows in the hallway, the cobwebs draped over every doorway, the gothic furniture, the fog machine in the background, all of it depends on that stark, high-contrast, black and white look to sell the joke of a horror movie family living an ordinary suburban life. Across its full run of 70 episodes between September 1964 and May 1966, the series aired entirely in black and white. But the very first version of the pilot, the one filmed to sell the concept to network executives, was shot in full, vivid color. In that footage, the role of the Munster mother is played not by DiCarlo but by an actress named Joan Marshall, and the Munster son, later famous as Eddie, isn't Butch Patrick at all. He's played by a child actor named Nate Derman, and his version of the character is a completely different creature, snarling, wild-eyed, and considerably more feral than the polite, wolf-eared kid who eventually became a household name. Then, after all of that had already been filmed, cast, scripted, and edited into a complete presentation, the studio quietly shelved the whole thing and rebuilt the show almost from scratch before a single episode ever reached the public. That abandoned footage survives today under the title My Fair Munster. Multiple versions of it exist, including a full color cut and a longer black and white version with additional material, and both are available for anyone curious enough to track them down. Understanding why this pilot got scrapped means looking closely at the calendar, because the timing turns out to be the whole story. On September 18, 1964, ABC premiered The Addams Family. Just 6 days later, on September 24th, CBS premiered The Munsters. Two competing networks had somehow developed sitcoms about macabre families living in Gothic houses at nearly the exact same moment, and while the two shows were developed independently of each other, that timing put enormous pressure on how each one needed to look and feel once it actually reached air. Universal had one major built-in advantage going into that competition. It already owned the classic monster characters outright. Herman drew directly from the world of Frankenstein's creature. Lily and Grandpa came out of the Dracula tradition. Eddie was rooted in the Wolfman mythology. These weren't new creations dreamed up for television. They were characters pulled straight from Universal's own horror catalog dating back to the 1930s. Even the house itself carried history, since the exterior had already appeared on the Universal backlit in other productions. That connection to Universal's classic monster legacy mattered enormously once the pilot needed retooling, and it explains a lot about the show's underlying structure. At its heart, The Munsters was built on the rhythm of a completely ordinary domestic sitcom. complete with everyday family problems and warm, tidy endings. The joke was simply that this kind, wholesome household happened to be full of literal monsters who had absolutely no idea how strange they looked to everyone else in town. Once CBS committed to picking the show up, a wave of changes followed almost immediately, and the first target was Joan Marshall's character. According to accounts from people involved with the production, network executives felt her version of the Munster mother read too close to Carolyn Jones's portrayal of Morticia Addams on the rival show, right down to the dark hair, the black dress, and the sharper, more sensual line delivery. Marshall was let go, Phoebe Munster disappeared entirely, and Yvonne DiCarlo stepped into a substantially reworked version of the role now named Lily. That wasn't simply a new actress wearing the same costume. The character itself changed shape. Lily became warmer toward Eddie, more affectionate with Herman, and calmer overall, carrying herself with quiet confidence rather than icy mystery. That shift did a huge amount of work for the finished show, because the entire premise only really lands if the monsters clearly and sincerely love one another. Their strangeness only works as comedy because their home life underneath it is steady, devoted, and completely genuine. DiCarlo's casting came with its own behind-the-scenes friction that most viewers never would have guessed from watching the finished product. She signed on to the role in the spring of 1964, and by the time filming began, some of her own castmates weren't fully on board with the decision. Both Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis reportedly raised concerns with producers before they'd even worked with her, worried that a genuine Hollywood leading lady wouldn't blend naturally into the show's particular brand of broad, silly comedy. Their hesitation made a certain kind of sense on paper. DiCarlo had been a working film star since 1940, appearing in major studio productions and eventually landing a widely remembered role as Sephora, wife of Moses, in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. She'd also earned 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame by the time the Munsters came calling. So why would an actress with that kind of resume take a supporting role in a monster sitcom, buried under heavy makeup on a black and white soundstage? Part of the answer was financial necessity. Her husband, stuntman Bob Morgan, had suffered a devastating injury during a stunt that cost him a leg and effectively ended much of his working life, and the steady paycheck from a network television series mattered. Whatever doubts her co-stars carried into the production didn't last. Al Lewis later summed up the outcome in 3 blunt words. They'd been wrong. There's another detail buried inside nearly every episode of the finished show that most viewers never notice, even after watching it dozens of times. Al Lewis played Grandpa, presented in the story as Count Dracula himself, an ancient vampire stretching back centuries, and the father of Lily. Their actual ages tell a completely different story than the one the show presented on screen. Yvonne DiCarlo was born on September 1, 1922. Al Lewis was born on April 30, 1923, which made him roughly 8 months younger than the actress playing his own daughter. Fred Gwynne, meanwhile, was born on July 10, 1926, making him the youngest of the 3 main adults despite playing the household's much younger husband. On screen, none of that registered. Grandpa read as genuinely ancient, Lily as his solidly middle-aged daughter, and Herman as the relative newcomer to the family. Behind the makeup and the performances, the actual age gaps ran almost entirely in reverse. Every time Grandpa complained about his advanced years or shuffled around his basement laboratory muttering about the old country, audiences were watching a man who happened to be younger than the actress playing his daughter completely sell the illusion of old age through posture, voice, and timing alone. There's an odd extra layer to that particular illusion, too. For much of his life, Al Lewis publicly claimed he'd actually been born in 1910, which would have made him roughly 13 years older than his real age, and that claim followed him for decades, showing up in interviews and even in some of his early obituaries before his son eventually confirmed the real birth year on record. So the actor spending his workdays pretending to be centuries older than he actually was also spent much of his private life quietly inflating his own age in the opposite direction, for reasons that were never entirely clear even to people who knew him well. Fred Gwynne's transformation into Herman demanded something considerably more physically punishing than anyone watching at home could have guessed. Before the costume department ever touched him, Gwynne already stood 6'5", having studied at Harvard, where he served as president of the Harvard Lampoon, alongside building a parallel career as a serious painter and later as a published children's author. Playing Herman meant adding heavy platform boots, reportedly with Saul's adding roughly 4 to 5 extra inches, pushing his total height up towards 7 feet. On top of that came somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds of padding built into the costume itself to broaden his frame, plus a foam prosthetic piece fitted over his head to create Herman's distinctive flat skull. Before a single scene could be filmed, Gwyn routinely sat through 2 to 3 hours of makeup application. The finished result read as broadly comic on screen. The actual process of achieving it was exhausting and often genuinely uncomfortable. The suit's weight put constant strain on his back. The elevated boots made ordinary movement stiff and awkward, and the hot studio lighting made an already heavy costume even harder to endure for hours at a stretch. Accounts differ on the exact numbers, but multiple sources describe him losing significant weight through sweat during single days of shooting, and the crew reportedly kept him hydrated with large amounts of liquid between takes, at times using a hose of cool or compressed air blown down into his collar just to help him make it through to the next setup. Despite all of that, Gwyn consistently delivered a performance full of warmth, comic timing, and genuine emotional vulnerability. When Herman's feelings got hurt over some small domestic slight, Gwyn played it as both funny and quietly sincere at the same time, all while balancing on elevated boots, carrying tens of pounds of padding, and working under makeup that had taken hours to apply that morning. The other cast members had their own demanding transformations too, but Gwyn consistently carried the heaviest physical burden of anyone in the main cast, and it shows in just how convincingly enormous and imposing he manages to look in nearly every scene. One of the strangest details connected to the entire production only becomes clear once you know what was actually happening on set versus what audiences eventually saw on their television screens. Fred Gwyn's face, contrary to what viewers might assume from the finished gray, corpse-like complexion, was actually painted a bright, vivid violet color while filming. That specific shade was chosen deliberately, because the way period cameras and studio lighting captured different colors on black and white film stock didn't map onto normal human intuition. Once that footage was developed and converted to grayscale, the striking purple face translated into the cold, pale monster gray audiences came to recognize instantly. That means anyone physically present on the Universal set between 1964 and 1966 was looking at something viewers at home never actually saw: a towering man in a bright violet face, heavy padding, and elevated boots that made him look even larger than his already considerable natural height. That detail leads directly into a bigger question worth asking. Why was the Munsters filmed in black and white at all, when color television was already spreading rapidly by the mid-1960s? Even the show's own original pilot, the color version featuring Phoebe instead of Lily, had already proven the production was fully capable of shooting in color. Part of the answer came down to straightforward cost, since producing an entire season in color carried a meaningfully higher price tag than CBS and Universal wanted to absorb for a new series. The other part came down to style. Black and white helped tie the show visually back to Universal's own classic horror pictures from the 1930s. The Frankenstein and Dracula films the Munster characters were directly modeled on. So the sitcom was deliberately built to feel connected to that earlier cinematic world, filmed in places on the same physical studio lot where those original monster movies had once been shot decades earlier. Beverly Owen played Marilyn, the blonde niece the family regarded as the household's unfortunate, plain-looking relative, a running joke that worked precisely because Marilyn looked completely ordinary to everyone outside the family, while the Munsters themselves worried endlessly about her looks as though she'd been cursed with normalcy. Owen played the role for the show's first 13 episodes, and for much of that stretch, she reportedly wanted out. Her fiancé, future Sesame Street writer and director John Stone, remained in New York while her contract kept her working in Los Angeles, and by multiple accounts she was visibly unhappy during that separation, at times breaking down in tears on set. According to interviews given years later by her castmates, both Fred Gwyn and Al Lewis eventually spoke to producers on her behalf, and she was ultimately released from her contract. She returned to New York, married Stone, and largely stepped away from acting. It's worth being careful with how that story gets framed, because it isn't really a tragedy. Owen went home, married the person she wanted to marry, and built the life she'd actually been hoping for the entire time. The show, for its part, handled the transition with a small, quietly clever trick. When Pat Priest took over the role starting with the 14th episode, the production kept Marilyn's distinctive headband and general hairstyle consistent between the two actresses, and the physical resemblance between Owen and Priest was close enough that plenty of casual viewers apparently never noticed the switch had happened at all.